He's an area expert in the Middle East. However, over a lot of years, I have engaged in various ways with most countries of the world in one way or another in studying. So I have some degree of appreciation of issues, as I hope will be apparent later in my talk. But at the beginning of my talk, I'm going to start at a rather general level to talk about what we mean by knowledge-based economy, or what might be meant by a knowledge-based economy, because indeed it's a kind of rhetoric, and understanding this rhetoric and how it's employed is an important before we go advocating that we should all become knowledge-based economies. So first thing to say is every society is knowledge-based. Okay, there aren't any societies in the world that aren't knowledge-based. Okay, but that there are different kinds of knowledge. For example, survival as a city dweller requires a different kind of knowledge than knowledge as a herdsman, for example. And the use of the phrase, therefore, suggests that some types of knowledge are particularly valuable or essential for the 21st century. Okay, so the first issue is what kinds of knowledge are we talking about? Okay, and the extent to which this is true depends upon the composition of economic activities within a particular society. So if a society is entirely dominated, for example, by natural resource income, income from petroleum, for example, then a particular kind of knowledge will be elevated, okay, in relationship to other forms of knowledge within that society. And we would say that in petroleum-based economies are generally interested, as some of the earlier comments suggested, in diversification, in building a future. We'll come back to future issues in just a moment. But there are also other countries that are less dependent, less able to exploit natural resources, and then those countries have to find other forms of economic activities, each of which has associated knowledge, each of which is associated with particular kinds of knowledge. So the trends that I would identify as particularly important are these three here. The growth of science-based industries and the scientific and technical knowledge associated with those industries. Okay? The second is the growth of the so-called creative industries, which is a very dangerous term as well. You know, what isn't creative? Okay, but when we say creative, what we're really talking about is a collection of industries having to do with media, arts, and design, fashion, and so forth. And so these creative industries are a second big growth area for particular forms of knowledge. And the third, and perhaps the biggest of the three, is the use of scientific and technical knowledge to improve productivity in both traditional and more modern industries. And part of that is acquiring more modern industries, so the processes of technology exchange, acquisition of technology, and so forth. And so of the three, okay, perhaps the biggest impact that can be expected in any country, and particularly in either middle-income countries or countries that are very much reliant on their wealth for petroleum, is this third area. But I'll come back to that in a moment. So the collection of knowledge referred to in these three trends could be called modern knowledge. Okay, and that's that, of course, is a little controversial as well, but let's for the moment simply call that modern knowledge, knowledge that's relevant for the 21st century. So there are some common features of this modern knowledge. In each of the three areas, there are some common characteristics. It's incrementally improved with occasional punctuations, which we could call step changes. So, for example, the moving from the vacuum tube or the valve to the transistor, and then the transistor to the integrated circuit are step changes in the electronics industry. Okay? So the electronics industry proceeds by incremental progress except for step changes. And in that particular industry, there have been a lot of step changes. In other industries, there are fewer changes in step. The progress is more incremental. The second, it's cumulative. You build upon what it is that you've done before. So new knowledge tends to be based upon existing knowledge, except in the unsettled period of step change. In the step change period, the old knowledge gets wiped out, in part or entirely. A third characteristic is that modern knowledge is increasingly complex in two senses. The depth of specialization that's required is increasing. So the degree of specialization in order to be effective in the application of the knowledge is growing. And the other is that the range of specialisms that are needed for useful results is growing. So you have to, in fact, have more different types of specialities involved in the production of modern industry and the use of modern technology. And the last is that the processes of knowledge exchange, by the way, I prefer this term knowledge exchange to knowledge transfer or technology transfer, because knowledge transfer or technology transfer involves a learning process, and learning is almost always interactive, as the earlier speaker was suggesting. So processes of exchange of knowledge involve the growth of the use of information, and while information is emphatically not the same thing as knowledge. Okay, so we are part of the defining feature of our era is the use of information technology. Here we have information technology surrounding us, but that information technology is not knowledge. We have a process of constructing from information our own understanding of the world, and that constitutes knowledge. Our understanding constitutes knowledge, whereas the words on this page constitute information. The two are not directly connected. Otherwise, I could simply give you my slides and sit down, and that would be the end of the day. So a considerable attention has been devoted in the last 30 years to the Asian miracle. For example, the Republic of Korea and Ghana start at basically the same level when we're talking about the 1950s. And 20 years later, in the 1970s, there's not very much difference to illustrate. 50s, Ghana and South Korea. 70s, Ghana and South Korea. Okay. 1990, Ghana and South Korea. Okay. The measure, per capita GDP. Okay. Now, the claim is that the difference between patterns of development in these two countries is largely the consequence of knowledge. Difference attributed to knowledge here by the World Bank. And what they mean by that would require more time than I have, but it has to do with how we account for long-term economic growth and how we decompose long-term economic growth to source. Okay, how much is due to accumulation of capital and how much is due to accumulation of labor, how much is not explained by either forms of accumulation, but is in fact the productivity of capital and labor used together. And that additional element, okay, which actually is the starting point for my field of science, technology, and innovation studies, is that actually, compared to traditional understandings where accumulation was the story, the modern story is, well, actually, it's that other thing. The thing that's not about accumulation of capital and labor, but about knowledge, that really makes the difference in economic growth. So today, the GDP of Ghana is about 3,100 US dollars in purchasing power parity terms. In Korea, it's 31,000. So literally in a lifetime, in my lifetime, there's been a gap of a tenfold difference arising between these two countries. Most of the middle income countries in the world ask how it might be possible to duplicate this performance and what role knowledge has played in the success of countries such as Korea. All right, now let me come on to the Middle East. We've already talked about definitions a little bit, and just for simplicity, I've taken the ESCWA definition. It's not it includes North African countries, even though the ESCWA refers to West Asia. Well, there's some problems there, but it prominently excludes some other countries that share some of the cultural features, for example, of Islam. So you have countries of Iran and Turkey, for example, are conspicuously absent from this list of countries. It is defined around Arab countries, but some of these societies are more heterogeneous in composition than others. Some of them are more homogeneous than others. So as any audience familiar with the region understands, this grouping of countries is paradoxical. It includes countries with strong natural resource bases and countries that have no such sources of wealth. It includes some of the highest income countries in the world and also countries with very low incomes. And it includes countries with substantial degrees of industrialization and those with little modern industry. So it's very difficult to speak about the Middle East and North Africa in any sort of comprehensive and directed kind of way. So my way forward on this is to say, well, actually, these countries share some aspirations and features that are common, even though I've identified a lot of differences. Okay? Some of the features that are in common are an interest in catching up, defined by achieving similar level of sustainable income. That allows me to include the petroleum-based countries because at the end of the day, they're interested in a very long-term sustainability of their economic development. Second, referring to the earlier speaker's reference to youth, okay, it's a particular feature of all of these societies that they have very young populations, okay? So there's a desire to create satisfying and remunerative employment opportunities for these young people. And third, for those, specifically for those countries with petroleum wealth, an interest in diversifying, which I mentioned already. And assuming that these are common aspirations, it's possible to consider them from the viewpoint of the three defining trends that I mentioned earlier. And I'll bring in some of the general or common features of knowledge in talking about each of them. My point here, where I'm driving, is that the umbrella or overarching concept of knowledge-based economy is actually not very helpful when you come down to making policy, when you come down to making a specific plan for improving your economic circumstances. I've chosen these three trends specifically to illustrate the differences between policies that are relevant to the three different parts of knowledge-based growth. So if we speak about science-based industries, we're largely talking about creating elites. Okay? If you want to be a world-class science-based industry, you have to have the world-class scientific elite. Okay? But unfortunately, that's not enough. Okay? That elite also has to be able to exercise agency, to be able to take action and exercise entrepreneurial capacity. So all of the questions about regulation, about freedom to operate in a business sense become very relevant when we talk about science-based industry. You can have an elite science, create world-class science, and have no domestic impact whatsoever. Okay? So how does one connect the world-class science with entrepreneurial efforts within the economy becomes an important issue. Second important issue, coming back to East Asia, and the success of East Asia has a lot to do with the rise of what we call a techno-economic paradigm, which means a collection of technologies and the economic activities attached to them that dominate a particular era. Okay? So we live in the era of information and communication technologies. Okay? My father lived in the era of mass transportation, the growth of the automobile. And living in America, it was about the creation of things like the interstate highway system and the centrality of companies like General Motors to the U.S. economy in the 1950s, for example, and also other forms of transportation such as passenger aircraft, the age of the jet aircraft, and so forth. Earlier generations, okay, my grandparents living in an era of electrification, okay, the building of hydroelectric facilities in the part of the world where my family is from transformed life there. So every age has some techno-economic paradigm associated with it that dominates other forms. In our era, the scientific-based industry paradigm is around information communication technologies, and to a lesser extent, pharmaceuticals and other kinds of artificial health aids are important. So there's a problem there. We're already well along in that particular era. Okay, it forecloses entry opportunities when you're at a mature stage in a particular techno-economic paradigm. And we don't have, at this stage in history, a very rapid rise in a new paradigm. Okay? So we don't have, if you think of it as a wave, okay, and think of it as surfing, okay, it's difficult now to find the wave to ride for a particularly good surfing experience. Okay? The waves are a little bit smaller. So in constructing, the last point I have about science-based industries is that those countries that have had success with science-based industry growth have done so in part by harnessing the diaspora. Okay? That is, persuading the people that have been abroad for a number of years or perhaps most of their careers to return home and contribute to development efforts in their country of origins. And this is not unique to China or any of the East Asian countries. It's true in many times in history. And the other feature, a little bit more controversial, is the value of cultural diversity. So cultural diversity played a very important role in England in the form of Quakers, for example, contributing to English industrialization. And when life was not so comfortable for Quakers in England, we benefited a great deal in the United States from having those people emigrating to us. And in fact, the United States has benefited enormously from people emigrating to the US in order to avoid whatever form of persecution as a minority they experienced in their home countries. Okay? It's a recurrent source of advantage. So cultural diversity plays a role because it is culturally diverse communities that often are contributing to the elites necessary for science-based industry. Now, creative industries. Creative industries, and now this will be a little bit more controversial. It's always hazardous to speak, particularly with an audience who knows much more than I do about the region, but I'm going to characterize the Middle East and North Africa as relatively conservative societies. Okay? And by that, I mean it's difficult to reconcile a conservative social and cultural view with many of the manifestations of creative industries. Creative industries generate deviance from social norms. Okay? They generate people that don't exactly fit, okay, in a whole variety of senses. We talked about gender issues. Well, there are further issues beyond men and women, okay, and we speak about creative industries. We also have to be talking about greater diversity than simply male and female diversity. So not only, but also cultural diversity, diversity of opinion and view compared to other people in the society. Historically, and there's been, I have some confidence now because there was great reference to history. Historically, there have been periods in the life of Islam in which there was much greater tolerance. In those periods, their enclaves were more tolerated, and creative industries generally thrive within enclaves. So it's about creating sheltered spaces or places where people feel safe that such industries might arise. An attractive feature of such industries is that they require relatively less initial investment and can be built incrementally within a human lifetime by a founder entrepreneur to some substantial size. An example of that is the fashion company Zara, okay, one of the world's wealthiest individuals. Okay, you may know his origins on a very modest community in Spain that has no other redeeming features really from a global economic performance point of view, but because of his imagination transforming an important part of the fashion industry and earning great personal wealth from doing so. Finally, this area of productivity improvement in modern and traditional industries. As I said at the beginning, probably the most promising of these three areas, sustained improvements in productivity require very substantial social transformation. And this is the tough point. Virtually all modern technologies require a high level of basic education and empowerment of those actually doing the work. So that can be a problem if you're living in a society which is quite hierarchically oriented, okay, in which the boss is supposed to know what to do and direct everyone else to doing it. Then it's very difficult to perform in modern industry. Actually, there needs to be some recomposition of work roles and identities within the workplace in such a way that people are empowered and able to make their own contributions. Many years ago, I was interviewing people in a Japanese integrated circuit fabrication facility, and one of the things they said, well, one of the reasons that we have a relatively even status or hierarchy difference within our organization is we know because of the war, okay, because of World War II, that people were displaced from their initial position. Okay, their family might have had a venerable, noble tradition, but because of the disruptions of the war and the subsequent chaos, they were dislocated from their current position. So we don't assume that because somebody's doing a modest job that they have a modest background. Okay? We don't assume that because somebody's doing a high job that they're necessarily entitled to that position. So you can see that there are some important sort of social ideas lying behind this idea of improving productivity. All right, then a couple other points. Technology transfer, as I suggested earlier, is a very misleading concept. Technologies can be acquired, you can buy them, okay, but in order to use them effectively, you have to harness this other process of social transformation. And research has demonstrated that learning in many different forms, not only in the classroom from the books, but experiential learning, is the essence of productivity improvement. Thus, neither research and development, which is a common indicator that's used about knowledge, nor technology transfer necessarily or themselves offer a path to making productivity improvement. So there's no magic bullet here, okay? It's a process of social development. And because of complexity and specialization, the range of capabilities needed is much broader than any single company is likely to have, which draws attention to how a society organizes its systems or networks for making improvements. And that comes back to the industry, because if I was to ask our previous speaker a question, it would be about how the university is interacting with industry and achieving more of a national system of improvement and progress. So to conclude, all economies are knowledge-based, but certain features of modern knowledge are what is really referred to when we use the term knowledge-based economy. Science-based industries, creative industries, and the modernization of traditional industries, and the acquisition adaptation, okay, because these two go hand in hand, acquisition and adaptation,